Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historian page on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for joining us on this Monday evening. Tonight, I am once again reunited with my great friend, Peter Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Pete, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, John. Thank you. John, you disappointed me just a little bit. You usually have a new nickname for me, but we've done so many shows together, right?
I know. I'm running out of nicknames.
We've run out of nicknames. Well, John, it's great to be back, and especially for tonight's show to introduce Steve Berry of the University of Georgia, where he is the Gregory Professor of Civil War History. I'll give you a quick bio of Steve. I think he's a native of Florida. Is that correct, Steve? You did your undergrad, and I didn't look it up. It's a private college. I cannot remember the name of it.
Rollins College.
Yeah. Rollins College. Undergrad at Rollins College, and then went off to North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he did his master's and Ph.D. And then from there, his first job was at UNC Pembroke, and there for a number of years before then going off to the University of Georgia. Steve has published a number of books, primary sources, secondary sources, edited books. I have just two from my library to show. We do a lot of show and tell here, Steve, which is going to be great for tonight because Steve is going to take us down his current projects, and they're all involving digital history. But before he took the leap toward digital history, he did monographs. We'll continue to do monographs. This is the edited book, Weirding the War, a great title, great cover, a range of essays that take, as you can probably guess, some very different angles on the Civil War era. And that was out of a conference that we did so long ago. How long ago was that, Steve?
I think it was 2007 or 8.
Yeah.
Maybe a little later.
It was fantastic. Yeah, it was wonderful. And then Steve's dissertation, one of my favorite books on the life of the common soldier, because what Steve does so brilliantly is he gets into the interior worlds of these men during their antebellum period, as well as the war years. And he recovers for us the importance, the centrality of the relationships that these men had with the women in their lives. You see in these men, these Southern men, who then became Confederate soldiers, you get a sense of all parts of their lives and their personalities. They're just not driven by honor. They're not just driven by killing Yankees. There's a lot more to them, and Steve captures it. And what Steve does, and does so well, and it's my only major reservation about Steve doing a lot of digital history, is I love Steve Berry's prose. He writes absolutely beautifully. And I know that you will continue to write when you do digital history, but I'm telling you, Steve Berry's monographs, they are absolutely worth your time. And I've said it to Steve, anything that Steve writes is absolutely worth reading. He has always, I think, a very different and important take on our field. And our last little personal anecdote here is something I learned tonight, Steve, as I was searching around CSI Dixie. You left an anecdote about when you were 7 years old, and they went around the horn asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? I believe one kid said maybe an astronaut. Another kid said a professional football player. And Steve did not say, I thought you were going to say championship wrestler. That's what I thought you were going to say. You did not say that, did you? Steve, what did you tell your little peers when you were 7 years old?
Well, I was kind of embarrassed because everything that came before me seemed like such a good option. I mean, somebody said they wanted to be a millionaire, as if you could just snap that was just like a profession that you could have. Yeah, so they were all going to be rock stars and millionaires, and I was already a history-inflected kid. So, but it seemed, I was going like a medievalist. I was like, they won't even know what that is. I thinking about an historian, but I was like, oh, I don't know, that's not going to be cool enough. So I think I said a wreck diver or something like, or Egyptologist. I can't even remember, but I was. I
think in your reflections on your blog, you said medievalist. You went with medievalist. And at recess time, but you're in Florida, right? But if you were up north in Chicago or something, maybe the kids made you, put your tongue on the frozen pummeled you in some way. So I'm sure you paid a price for saying that you wanted to be a medievalist. So tonight, what we're going to do is talk about the field of digital history. And it is, I think, the place to begin is to define digital history, which is such a capacious term and includes so much that it almost loses some of its meaning. So, Steve, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's going to be a real treat. I have a number of students who have tuned in as well. And so please send in your questions, and we'll be sure that as this conversation unfolds that we will get to them. So could you begin by just telling us a little bit about digital history, please?
Sure, absolutely. And I'll just say that I'm not a proselytizer about digital history. If I'm going to proselytize about anything today, it is that form follows function, and academe needs more forms so that it can have more functions, so that when we look at a project, we don't just think, oh, this has to be a book or it has to be an article. We need to be able to say, as John has said, this project has this particular audience, this particular function, so it must take this particular format, in this case, a podcast. And so when I look at digital history, I'm as skeptical of it as anyone else, but I know its comparative advantages. And that's what I really want to talk about tonight. So defining digital history is very new, obviously. And that means that, like any new realm of history, it suffers from a very weak vocabulary where things are not specific. The example I would use is the word project. There is actually no more elastic word in academe, especially in digital history, than the word project. Virtually everything is a project right now. And that is that tips you off that our taxonomy is not what it needs to be, to have a little more rigor. What are the functions? What are the forms? What is the purpose? What is the audience? There needs to be a word for all of those forms and formats, and there needs to be a better analysis and criticism of their functions. So I've thought about it a little bit, but we're in early days. One way to define digital history is to ask yourself, well, where's the digital intervention? It can really come in three places. It can come at the front end when you're collecting the data. So you can use digital modes of collecting big data, right? It could come in the middle when you're doing the analysis of the data. So you've acquired all of this data, but now you need a computer to go through it. Or it can come simply at the end in the distribution of the findings, as it might as at a website or as it might at a podcast. So that's one way to start to sharpen our thinking about digital history.
When you say collection of data through a digital means, can you give us something very concrete so people can visualize what that would potentially?
Right. So the difference would be, you might have a digital project that's overseen by librarians whose essential function is to make a massive amount of data, maybe it's handwriting, maybe it's whatever, more convenient, more searchable, more digestible on the web. But they're not making an argument. Right. So to qualify a scholarship, you have to make an argument about using a discrete set of sources, and that argument needs to connect to an ongoing argument in our debate, in our discipline, that hopefully has some present value. Right. Because otherwise, we're not just interested in old things because they're old. That makes you an antiquarian. If you're an historian, you are interested in old things because they changed. And because they connect to evolutions that connect to now. So change over time is what it means to be an historian. So you could have
Steve, can I just interrupt real quickly again, you might very well be getting to this, but I have on many of the talks that I give to roundtables, and now do it, of course, by Zoom. I've mentioned your outstanding private voices, which I think is a good example of a collection of primary source materials. Now, you interpret that and you do reach some arguments that come out of it, but the private voices, which maybe you'll define or describe a little bit later, is a collection of letters from semi-literate or illiterate soldiers, and it is gives us access to, I should say, sources that are very difficult to find in the archive. So I think to give you, again, something very specific about your first example, private voices, I'll say it again. The last talk I gave, one of the questions was, please tell us that source again. And a lot of people wrote me. They were really excited to go check out private voices. So, okay, I'm sorry. Interrupted you there. Keep going.
Actually, I think that's a fantastic example. So private voices, I would not call scholarship. It is the bedrock for future scholarship. the essential problem with Civil War history, especially if you're writing the history of the common soldier, is that you're mostly writing that history out of archives that are monuments to elite white families. So if you're talking about letters and diaries, what a family has to have for those to survive to now, right? They have to have a house that they don't move from, that doesn't get foreclosed upon. They have to have an attic that has a trunk in it. They have to hand all of that down generation to generation. And finally, for an archivist to find it worthy of enshrining in the best of what we have said and done and been. And that's certainly how my favorite, my beloved, my church, if history is a religion, the archive is my church. The Southern Historical Collection at UNC, that's how it got built. 1930s, J.D. DeRulac Hamilton driving around in a Ford collecting all of these old letters. Well, how do you write then? And you've done this so well, but then how hard it is. How do you write a history of the common soldier, truly common soldier, out of those sources? Mm-hmm. Social history teaches us to write history against the grain of our archives. But what digital history makes possible is build another archive.
I just, in fact, used Private Voices for an article I did. I was desperate to find the voice of the poor, semi-educated soldier from the Army of Tennessee. And as we know, there are thousands of them in the ranks. But as Steve so eloquently put it, they are not part of the traditional archive. I went to Private Voices and I got lucky. Mm-hmm. And there I found the perfect letter to juxtapose with the letter of an officer. Both of these men had very different ways that they made meaning of the catastrophe at Missionary Ridge. And it just, it's such an important source because it does exactly what Steve, I think, has suggested, that it allows us to challenge those traditional narratives that just come out of one layer of sources, which for far too long, historians, we've been saying this is the common or the majority experience. And it's hard to understand why we've said that for so long when we know that the archive, the traditional archive, is so deficient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Stephen, you brought up data earlier, and before we move into the different projects we're going to talk, or the different things we're going to talk about this evening. See, I'm guilty. I wanted to go over something with data, which is we often think of data in the scientific form. We don't think about it in the humanities form. And I wanted to ask you about that. Our audience may be accustomed to scientific data, especially in the days of COVID and virology and stuff like that we're hearing on a daily basis, but they may not be able to describe what humanities data is and how that's different. Would you like to go over that for us?
Yeah. So I one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight is digital history, is the history of datafication. Datafication as a process. Data structures as phenomenon in our life that limit what we can see and how we see it are unbelievably important. So I'll just give you one very quick example. The census in 1840 is taken essentially as a data level at the level of the household. So it is a list of mostly male names as heads of household, and then just tick marks enumerating the people who are within that household of a certain age and a certain slave status, et cetera. So if you think about how the state sees, in 1840, it sees the United States as a series of households. It cannot split the atom. It cannot see beneath the household as a data unit. In 1850, the census is taken, at least the population census, not Schedule II, the slave census, as individuals.
Right.
Now that doesn't, because you're equal as data does not make you equal as human beings, as we know. Right. It is a down payment on what is possible. Data structures actually matter. And so data is any information that can be disciplined into categories. It doesn't begin, in 1900. It happens well before that. Yeah. One of the examples that I'm going to talk a good bit about is a coroner's inquest, which I have datafied now 27,000 of them. And datafied is a word I think we should start to use, which means disciplining humanities information into something that it is searchable and quantifiable. Yeah. comparable data. But an inquest has a cause of death. It has a place where the body lays and is taken. It has a name of all the people who were at the inquest. It has a name maybe of a doctor. It can be datafied. It is a government form.
Right.
It doesn't look like it to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know that you both can see some of the comments and questions that are coming up. I do want to bring in Mike real quick. He's got a great question. How has digital history impacted historical methods and historiography, which is one of my favorite words that sends chills up people's spines with historiography, not just as a communication vehicle or to appeal to new audiences?
Right. So this would be and this gets us into the second mode of defining digital history. So let's say you can have digital history as scholarship. You can also have digital history as an archive, an archival resource, as we were just talking about. You can have digital history as a discovery tool. That is, it produces data visualizations where now I can see patterns that I wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. And now I have a question that I didn't have before. And coming up with good questions in history is sometimes even harder than the answers. And so I think digital, when you think capaciously about digital history, I think it's transforming the discipline. Yeah. Whether it is as a scholarship, as a seedbed for new scholarship in the form of archives, as a discovery tool in the form of data visualization, it is almost always public facing digital history because it turns into websites or podcasts or data visualization or whatever it might be. And it's flexible enough to invite the public in, not just to ask questions, but to actually contribute to the process because it's alive and ongoing. It isn't, when I wrote this book about Mary Todd Lincoln's family, all of these Todds came out of the woodwork and told me stories that I wish had been in the book. But it's too late. Because the book is frozen in amber. That's not true for a digital history project. So the degree of interplay that we have with our audience and our public is just another area. And then the last area I would say is the impact on social media. The fact that we can deploy our work very quickly to address issues of the moment in a way that you certainly can't if you write an article or a book and put that thing through peer review. That takes years. Right. I think digital history is transforming how history is disseminated and how it is done, how historical questions are conceived, and even transforming the archive itself.
Pete?
Well, Steve, you were going to walk us through some of your sites, and which one would you like to begin with?
Well, let's see if I can share the screen successfully.
There we go.
And as that comes up, Steve, just very quickly, it dawned on me that you see digital history as having this transformative impact on how we do scholarship, and that's undeniable. And I think that some of the things that you're going to talk about today will help us all imagine how, again, scholarship through this vehicle can take different forms. And while it all is very exciting, is there anything that you sort of lament, or maybe a better way of asking this is there anything that concerns you that digital history might leave something in the dust that shouldn't be lost and shouldn't be forgotten in terms of how we traditionally have done history, whether it be the monograph or the scholarly article?
Yeah, yes and no. So two things there. One, new media never destroy old media. So the radio is not destroyed by television. The television is not destroyed by the internet. Everything has to find its level. And that's what I call comparative advantage. Each of these media is particularly good at something, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a digital archive, whether it's digital scholarship, it's particularly good at something. If it sticks to what it's good at, if it sticks to its comparative advantage, if it's chosen for a reason, not because it's flashy or cool or seems like something you need to be doing or not doing, if it's kind of like, it's the old metaphor of the tools in the tool belt, right? I cannot hammer a nail with a pair of pliers or a screwdriver. I need to be good with my tools and know what they're good at doing. And then I think digital history is it's not going to supersede anything. It's going to wash over the discipline and find its level. The only thing I do worry about, but I think, and John, you'll agree with this, early days, I worried that digital history would be cost prohibitive and thereby anti-democratic. So we've gotten to a point with access to sources where virtually anyone, right, even if you didn't have a ton of research money, you could get access to primary sources and you could write fantastic things that change the field. And so the early wave of digital projects, I'll use that word, were democratizing. Lately, then there was this middle period where I worried that things were going to be too expensive, that you'd have to apply for digital history grants from the NEH or ACLS or all of those kinds of things. And so that it would lock people out. And I was very worried about that. But now, John, as you've said in your episode on podcasts, these things are not that expensive. We are creating a relatively level playing field again in the realm of digital history. So all of my sites are on Drupal. Drupal is open access and utterly free. And so it doesn't cost that much. So I do have worries, Pete, but
I'm going to give you a little bit of pushback. And as someone who is, a lifelong public historian, is there not some concern, Steve, that you have that with the traditional forms of publishing, monograph or article, that we have that process of peer review, process of gatekeepers, that now how is it going to be possible for the public to have a discerning eye in terms of what you and I might consider to be credible scholarship that has been conveyed through digital history, when we all know that the very fact that it has been democratized, and of course I want history for the people, of course, but do you have a concern or a worry that it's going to be absolutely bewildering to people as to where do we go? There's so many places and so many choices that the message has become so diffuse that our historiography, again for lack of a better word here, becomes fragmented. Right? So how would you address that?
So back to comparative advantage, and this is going to be a cheeky answer. That is not for me to answer. That's for presses to answer. That's what university presses do. They need to concentrate on their comparative advantage, which is in peer review, quality control, gatekeeping, and even monetization. That's what they've always been good at. Why should they throw that away now? Or why should I take that on myself now when I will be worse at it because it is not my comparative advantage? So the Mellon Foundation is doing a lot working with university presses, thinking about how they embrace the digital turn without losing. And in fact, actually have a greater set of tools for what it is that they've always been good at. So I think it's just all about translation from one form or format into another.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you before. You're going to lead us to your first site here.
That's okay. So yeah, let me just walk you through, assuming it loads. It's loading from Dropbox. So if not, we won't worry about it.
Well, as this is loading, Steve, could you also just tell the folks at home that besides the Gregory Chair that you have in Civil War Studies, you're also co-director of a virtual history center at the University of Georgia as well. And Steve, just there again, quickly, this center, how does this interact with your training of undergraduates as well as graduate students?
Right. Okay. So I've stopped the screen share. We're not even going to bother to do that. I was saying earlier that the only teaching technology that has never betrayed me is chalk, and I say that as a digital historian. And you have to be comfortable with that too, right? I mean, stuff happens. So yeah, the Center for Virtual History is sort of a warehouse for a series of mostly scholarly works. So I call, we don't want to use the word project, right? So I use a word that is never going to catch on, but I call it an archivograph. So
you're right. You'll never catch on.
So it's a monograph meeting an archive. So it's like a book being, it's a book bearing on its back the archive out of which it's constantly being written and rewritten in an endless way. And people can check what I'm saying against the sources. There's your point about quality control.
Mm-hmm.
The archive is right there. But anyway, so the Center for Virtual History has a number of original projects on it, many of them scholarly in this variety of ways that we talked about, whether they're discovery tools, whether they're building a new archive, whether they're a monograph in itself taken apart, or whether they have an active role in social media. We try to cover the waterfront in terms of these kinds of projects so we can experiment in these domains. And then, as you say, Pete, the part of digital history that we haven't talked about is our original public as teachers, which is digital history as pedagogy. I always think, what are our students actually going to go on to do? So once upon a time, right, the American labor market needed people who could read, write, do arithmetic, sit down and shut up. And so if you look at the way we taught them,
that's what we did.
That's what we did.
That's what we did.
So now they need project managers that can actually collaborate and create in a digital space. Well, don't our classrooms need to look that way too?
Mm-hmm.
The other part of this, and this, I feel this very keenly here in Georgia, if all of our state legislators had come through a history class where humanities knowledge wasn't something that boring guy was always, wrote a book about that I would, as a student would never read, in a process that was perfectly arcane and invisible to me. If instead humanities knowledge was co-created by groups of students and faculty and then given to the world, when that student becomes a state legislator or becomes a congressman or congresswoman and has some kind of say over humanities budgets, I think they will at least know what humanities knowledge is and how it's produced.
Well said.
Can John share one of the sites? Do you have that capacity, John?
Yeah, I can share my screen with. I have CSI Dixie up right now. I can bring that up.
Yeah, would that be okay, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I have some separate tabs open for each one, but
that's fine. So CSI Dixie collects 28,000 coroner's inquests taken in the 19th century South, and just the origin story and why it takes the form it does. And here's where I was saying that we need to defend the creative choices that we make. I was at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. I was trying to figure out why or how a distant relation of Johnny Cash's was killed in a hail of federal gunfire in 1884. So I said, well, I don't know. The coroner's records, what are these? Let me pull these. And I tell you what, it was like that moment in Pulp Fiction when they open the golden briefcase. When they pop the top on that box of coroner's inquest, I swear I was transformed and haunted and saddened, because in that box were maybe 300 tri-folded little bundles, and every one of them an ending. That's all it is. I would never know anything about the noon of any of these unfortunate lives, but I would know everything about the midnights. And I said to myself in that moment, Johnny Cash was long gone. And I said, I need to reproduce this experience. And I can't do it in a monograph. I can't cheapen these people into examples. I can't make one of them more important than another. This is the twin scales of human catastrophe, right? So a sense of the enormity and certainty of death, and yet everybody gets a story. Everybody gets to be an individual and have an individual life. And so I asked myself, okay, if it's not a monograph, what is it? And so that's how I got to archograph. And as I say, I've never escaped that. I'm like a sculptor that's constantly reworking the same clay. So every project that I have worked on since in the digital space owes its origins to CSI Dixie. So by the time I'm done, and we could talk about this too, by the time I'm done, CSI Dixie will essentially have been a website, which is to say an archograph, It will be a graphic history. It will be a straight up monograph now with UNC. It will be a podcast. It has already become a series of data visualizations in the history of datafication itself. And now I'm working on an art installation based on these same sources. And so it's kind of like, this is my true medium. I cannot escape the gravity well that is that dang box. I want to keep seeing it and re-seeing it in different forms so that I can become good at recognizing what forms have what comparative advantages. And I think if I learn that as an historian to be more attentive to form, the next time I open a box, I'll be able to say, oh, I know what this wants to be. I know how this wants to live in the world, because I've become more sensitized to form and format.
Steve, can you again help us in a really concrete way explain how the emotional connection that you felt when you looked at that, basically a ledger from a coroner that explained the outline of that individual's death, which I'm certain was probably very tragic and they're brutal. I suspect these people did not leave this world going gently. But you looked at that, and then how did some questions come out of, like, for example, you're looking for Johnny Cash's ancestor, whether it's Cash's ancestor or somebody else. How did that say, okay, wait a minute, this little scrap of paper here, what does it tell us? It tells us about how someone died. How does it tell us about that society lived, right? Because that's really where you're angling here, I'd assume.
Well, yes and no. So one of the things that I wanted to do is create a site that was flexible enough to have multiple through lines.
Okay.
So how would a genealogist look at this? Their through line is their ancestor. You can do that on this site. How would a statistician, what would their through line be on this site? All the data viz is right there. Everything has been datafied down to 3 degrees of precision on cause of death. How would a social worker look at this? Actually, a social worker would see almost immediately that what you have in the 19th century rural South is a place where everyone, all of the whites anyway, are dramatically underemployed, have no treatment programs, teach nobody to swim, have no access to birth control. There are no social services. That place is going to be a bleak hellscape and with no redeeming features. I have been to that land and we do not want to go back there. But to your point, Pete, can it also have a through line for an historian? Can it make an argument? And I believe absolutely that it does, because it is giving you, as you say, the view from the morgue. Now, should every society be judged solely by its morgue? No. Does every society have to answer for its morgue? Absolutely. Does every social justice question end up being best revealed at the morgue? Yes. We're living it now.
Absolutely.
We lived it in Katrina, right? The structures of power as they exist will always tell in the end. So how one individual dies, maybe that doesn't tell you anything. How how a society dies in aggregate tells you everything about how they lived.
Steve, and then I'll let John jump in here. I believe you found some documents of enslaved people, coroner reports about enslaved people. Is that correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So could you again give us some specific, and before I forget, I'm also curious as to why Johnny Cash's ancestor died in a hail of bullets. Federal authorities. So I got 2 questions here. I don't know which one you want to take first.
Well, let me tackle the CSI Dixie, when it came out, we were featured in the New York Times as one of a handful of sites that are giving a sort of new insights into life among the enslaved. And in fact, CSI Dixie's data is now being hoovered up by the open linked digital humanities project at Mellon, which is, $1.5 million that should try to link together all of the nation's databases that reveal life among the enslaved. So the thing you have to understand about a coroner's inquest is that there's a degree to which this is not as much a legal event as it is a kind of community event. And so the enslaved are allowed to testify at a coroner's inquest, where they would not be allowed to testify at a jury trial. So we have cases where essentially jury nullification, an all-white jury, as they were all white male juries on a coroner's inquest, come to the conclusion that an enslaved woman has died of apoplexy, but you have a note inside, evidence from her daughter saying that they hit mama with a shovel. So if you want to do a civil rights cold cases, not from the 1960s, which we have, and they've rolled some people up, right? There's no statute of limitation on murder. Mm-hmm. Well, you can do that for the 19th century. Everybody's dead, I understand, and it's not going to feel like a sort of justice that we might prefer. But there is a justice in naming names. There is a justice in revealing what actually happened, as in they hit mama with a shovel. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you can do a cold cases project for the 19th century using these documents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So since
what about Johnny Cash's ancestor? Why did he get tried?
Yeah. So he was an outlaw. Yeah. So it's in the blood. He was he shot the sheriff. I'm not kidding.
Wow.
He murdered a sheriff, and the posse caught him in a barn, and he died in a hail of federal gunfire.
So why did he shoot the sheriff? Do we know?
Oh yeah, we absolutely know. So that's actually a story. Everything comes back to CSI Dixie, Pete.
Yeah.
So remember the twin scales of human catastrophe I was talking about? People are bad with numbers. And so I always use that fantastic datification of the slave trade in 4 minutes. Everybody's seen it, right? Where each dot is a boat that's coming out of West Africa, and it looks like Africa's bleeding out in arterial spray. But none of it means anything if you haven't read Equiano.
Right.
If you haven't said that every one of those dots is a ghost ship of unhappiness, like that one. Now you can see it at scale, because you have to see at both scales simultaneously. That's the function of CSI Dixie. It never lets go of both scales. So you see the summative in the statistical, but you never lose the human and the individual. And so the story that you're talking about it's called a chronicle on CSI Dixie. But it's called Reconstruction Gothic, and Johnny Cash's relative is a character in this long form narrative devoted to it's the South in 7 deaths. So it weaves together 7 coroner's inquests into one long, sad story. Right. But that's another example of playing with form.
Right.
So since I'm also all about opening all this up to the public, I want to bring in a couple of questions from the audience going forward here. There was one here where Buck asked, do you see a time where archives become more commonplace and creating the democratization you mentioned through these methods?
I definitely think so. I mean, I've been reading a lot in the history of datafication, and there's this, I think this is over the top, but the idea that data is the new oil. If we think about, what we have in our pockets, that phone, all it's doing is keeping track of clicks. It's keeping track of our traffic and where we go. And it is selling that. What does Facebook do? We have a whole economy now that's devoted to attention. Mm-hmm. And the way it makes its money is by studying our behavior. That is collecting our data. Okay, that's fine. What we haven't done is gone back in time to truly collect all of this historical data. That means there's a lot of oil under the ground where historians are going to be key in explaining the context in which that data was created, the biases that it would inevitably have had, the way it can be read and understood and translated. Mm-hmm. I think historians are going to have a major role in this longer process of datafication as we build these new archives.
Mm-hmm.
But, Steve, and I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here, and I absolutely agree where there's these rich possibilities. But what about the Cliometricians in the 1960s and 70s? Were they not onto something, or did they simply lack the technical power to be able to translate all that information that they were collecting in the 60s and 70s? Is what you're suggesting, how is it different from what the Cliometricians did?
Fundamentally different. Thank you for asking that question. Okay, so here's the problem. The Cliometricians, to a degree, it was hubris. So what they were trying to do is to say that actually numbers can answer these old questions definitively, finally, and forever. So stop having an argument, stop basing it on a few sources. I'm going to tell you what the truth is because it's in the numbers. That is hubris. What digital humanities does generally and digital history does specifically is not seek to answer any questions through numbers, but seeks to raise new questions that might then yield to traditional methods. So just to give you examples from my own work, I have datafied all of the coroner's inquest for the 19th century. Between 1800 and 1865, when it comes to accidents, men drown, women burn.
Oh, gosh.
And when you think about it, of course, men are outside creatures. They are often working near water. There are no YMCAs. Nobody teaches anybody how to swim. Almost all transportation is on water. They're going to drown because they're outside creatures. Women are inside creatures. They're working around hot stoves. There's no fire safety whatsoever. The only way to heat a house is with a fireplace. Of course, they're all fire traps, all of them. And we know that that's true. Okay, so that's not a new question necessarily, but it does tell me that I need to put some emphasis on this issue. What about this one? Between 1800 and 1865, the most common method of suicide among men and women is not a firearm. And after 1865, it is.
What's the most common method before?
Anything that was cheap, hanging.
Hanging, right.
Wow.
But now I have a new question. Was Belial right? that the South actually just flooded with guns. The Winchester was the gun that won the South before it was the gun that won the West. But not before, because they were too expensive or they didn't work well or we don't know what. But now I have a new question. And I'm not, that's not Cliometrics. I'm not answering it. I'm asking.
I think there's a great question here that I definitely want to get to before we move forward, and because many of these projects are being utilized by students, being built by students, and Brandon Neely asks, on a practical level, what skills should current history students be developing to succeed in the digital history environment post-graduation? Thank you, Brandon.
Because Brandon can't get that answer at Gettysburg College from the class he takes at 8:30 in the morning. He can't get it there, so he's got to go to Professor Berry.
He comes to the tattooed historian to get the answer.
Here he comes. Skirt the academic. All right.
So there are a couple of possibilities here. One is we don't understand data very well. It's unbelievable, even how bad I was. Like when I went to make my first spreadsheet, what I named the categories and how I disciplined it so that apples could be compared to apples and oranges to oranges was just appalling. So for all of my understanding of the context in which the data was created, it did not help me translate humanities information into even a spreadsheet, much less one of these other digital history forms. And so I would start with thinking hard about data logic, data infrastructure, its history, how it works. And you get good at it, right? You start, it's like seeing the matrix. Once you learn to read data at the structural level, you can't unsee it. So whenever you see a company and the way it's collecting data, you're like, oh, I see this bias, I see this problem. That's not going to be logical. Oh, wait, this could be information that you didn't know you were getting, but now I can ask it. You just get more savvy about, like, we're super savvy about race as a structure and as a technology. We're super savvy about gender as a structure and as a technology. We are not savvy about data as an historical structure. We don't see in it. We don't see it. but we can get better at it.
So we actually have at Gettysburg College, we have a minor in data science. It's relatively new. So that, Brandon, might be something to look into. Just before you go on, I'm still trying to visualize. You say that societies are not very good at understanding how they organize data, right? That's your point, right? So can you give me an example from the Civil War era in which our ability, with the advantage of hindsight, that we're able to see how they were organizing their lives, their thoughts, their perceptions around data that wasn't readily apparent to them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a perfect example would be the mortality census of 1850. Right. So the mortality census of 1850, which I sort of datafied on a whim, right, is unbelievably bad data. Right. So the way it works is the census taker came around, knocked on your door, asked all the questions for Schedule 1 and 2, demography and your enslaved holdings, right, and then asked if anyone had died in that household over the last year. Right. Now, we can immediately see, even from our perspective, that is a terrible way to conduct a public health survey. First of all, nobody's going to answer the door to the census man and say, "Oh yeah, I murdered a guy last week," right? Or my unwed daughter died on the birthing couch, 2 days ago, and I want to tell a perfect stranger about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they're not diagnosticians. This is Farmer Ted. He doesn't know anything. So they're saying, they'll just as likely to give too little information or to give too much. So they have people who are dying of menstruation, dying of herpes. That is a massive case of herpes. Or dying of masturbation, which I don't think so. Probably not. But it does say, that alone says something about the world and how they're datafying it, right? Masturbation could actually kill you. Homesickness, they think, could kill you. Their categories for what is actually deadly is based more on their feelings for things. And so what I call that is vernacular death. Yes. It isn't death as we understand it. It is, though, as they understood it. Mm-hmm. But here's the history on top of that, right? The data is bad data. It's also big, and it's going to get big, better, fast. So by 1880, they figured out that space or place is a better indicator of certain diseases than race. They're having to get over their racism because their data is teaching them that white supremacy is killing them too. Right? Mm-hmm. By 1890, the mortality census is tabulated by the American Tabulating Machine Company. That's IBM. They're building the supercomputer because it might be bad data, but it's big bad data, and it's driving a data industry that's going to get big, better, fast. Mm-hmm. So, and here's the upshot of all of this, and this is the book that I just finished at UNC. Global life expectancy doubles between 1850 and 1950. It is the most important thing that ever happened, and nobody ever talks about it. And one of the ways it happens is not just vaccines or antisepsis. It's data. It's the capacity to see. Right? And when a state can see, it can do terrible things, like the Holocaust. There's no more chilling scene in Schindler's List than laying out the paperwork and the desks and turning modernity to the project of murder. But when a state can see, it can do remarkable things too, like slay smallpox. We killed smallpox. It was killing 2 million people a year, and now it's gone. Mm-hmm. The data has consequences, and it reveals things about the context in which it was created, about the project that the folks who created it were embarked upon. It reveals things they didn't know they were sharing with us, and it's undergirding every significant change over the course of the 19th century.
Okay, well said. Very interesting.
Stephen, you talked about putting things in different models and such, not only having a database to utilize digitally, but also having, in this case, voice, having a podcast. Talk to us about the podcast coming up called Inquest.
Yeah, so remember, it's a constant reworking of the same material. So Inquest is a spin-off of CSI Dixie, and it's not spelled it this way here, but it's supposed to be capital I, capital Q. So we are in quest of something. And the idea, again, experiment with form, is that you take one, to your point, Pete, you take one death and then peel it like an onion to reveal not just the context of that death, but the context of the times in which it occurred. Try to tell the whole story of the culture from the death of one person. So in this case, the death was a white, wealthy landowner in Jasper County named Coleman Dumas Sr. And he was killed by his employee, whom you see here, Preston Cobb. Preston Cobb in December 1961 was sentenced to Georgia's electric chair. He had 37 days to live. It's sort of like a replacement for lynching, which is these rush to judgment laws. Pass them as quickly as possible and get them in a chair. The problem for that project was that Preston Cobb was 15 years old, and it was in the wake of Emmett Till. And so the civil rights movement has gotten started keenly considering trying to save Black youth and Black innocence. And so Preston Cobb becomes a cause célèbre. A sixth actually, of the Netherlands signs a petition for a stay of execution.
Wow.
And his case, I think, is integral to the only moratorium on the death penalty in the United States is between 1972 and 1976. And it's partly because of the Cobb case that we actually brought the death penalty to its knees. Of course, it became more and more popular through the 1980s and the drug war, and even through Clinton, and it's about to be underwater again. The Biden administration is taking a good hard look. We've already seen in Virginia, right, has already put a moratorium on the death penalty. So, John, this goes to your point about forms and formats of history that can act quickly to respond to and give context, historical context to debates that are apt otherwise to become, untethered from reality or over passion or what have you. And the podcast format, as you know so well, can respond very flexibly and relatively inexpensively to the debates of the moment. And so that's what we're trying to do with Inquest.
And provide that long history, that context that I think the three of us and the people who are watching right now can all agree upon is our great strength in our profession, our love of context.
Yep.
We all know how crucial it is. Again, Steve is pretty remarkable that he does all of these things. I'm going to introduce another vehicle, a recent vehicle that Steve is interested in, graphic novels. But before I do that, I should note that Steve is the secretary/treasurer of the Southern Historical Association. It is an academic association, which is one of the most, I would say, inviting and welcoming academic organizations. Has a conference every year. Hopefully we'll be in New Orleans in November. We'll do a range, again, of topics and panels. And again, I'm really excited to see what Steve is going to be able to do with this academic conference again, so that it changes with the times. So he does that. He also supervises really isn't the right word, but he is the dissertation advisor for a number of graduate students. And I think we might have a Gettysburg student who'll be coming your way next fall. And so he works with a lot of young and up and coming historians as well. So he's busy on all fronts. And his most recent venture, I'm going to show you, this is not Steve's, but it is a graphic novel that I've assigned, that I've not read. I've assigned it for my class on race and slavery. And just say, again, for those at home, I guess they probably don't need to see this, but just in case, here's your, we shouldn't call it a graphic novel. What should I call it, Steve?
It's graphic history or graphic nonfiction.
There you go. So, Steve, could you tell us a little bit about the genre, and then can you again sort of reflect upon how this is going to be something that'll be part of your tool chest as you move forward?
Okay, so that's a great point. The reason to do a graphic history is not just to do it. It is because for some particular reason, whether the function, the source itself, or the audience that you're seeking to reach requires this, or this particular form has the comparative advantages that you need. And so I'm working on a graphic history of Prince Rivers, whom I regard as the most consequential American about whom Americans know nothing. Prince Rivers was an enslaved carriage driver in Beaufort, South Carolina, just before the Civil War. He is basically the family's GPS. He's a stellar boatman and a crack coachman, and we don't think about how valuable those things would have been. So this is a guy that can get you anywhere that you want to go, in a world where these folks don't really know how to get anywhere necessarily. But the irony, of course, is that he could get anywhere on his acumen, but he can go nowhere. He reminds me very much of Frederick Douglass looking at those ships a sail in Baltimore Harbor. So basically day one of the Civil War, he takes his family into the interior because they're living obviously in the coastal area of South Carolina. The blockade needs anchorage points fast to make that work. So we're talking very early days of the Civil War. He comes back and he joins up as a soldier, even though he can't. There's no USCT in sight, but David S. Hunter is the commander in that department, and he is engaging in a little experiment about arming soldiers. And Prince Rivers becomes Color Sergeant, Company A, 1st South Carolina Volunteers. So your folks, John, will know how a regiment is formed. That makes him the first of the first of the first. So you're Company A of the 1st in the state, and now you're Color Sergeant, which is the highest rank that you can have. So he might have been one of the first Black men in uniform.
Wow.
I call him the tip of the black spear. Now, the 1st South Carolina does not fight at Gettysburg, does not fight at Vicksburg because they weren't allowed to. But I think they are more critical than the 54th Massachusetts in ensuring the formation of the United States colored troops. So we're all familiar with the 54th, Battery Wagner and Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick. But the question in that movie, I think, is wrongheaded. So the question in the movie is, will they fight? Will Black men, if you give them a gun, fight? In the white mind, the question was, if I give a Black man a gun, will he ever put it down? Will he ever stop fighting? That's the question. So what needed to be demonstrated for Lincoln and a fairly racist federal authority was that soldiers would demonstrate restraint. That was more key. The 1st South Carolina is essentially a federally sponsored slave insurrection because it's moving in the Confederate interior, liberating plantations. Some of the plantations they'd been enslaved upon, and family members were still enslaved upon. They were some of the first to engage Confederate troops, take Confederate troops captive. They were the first to capture a Confederate town in Jacksonville. And it's the news coming out of Jacksonville and the way Prince Rivers and his men deported themselves that convinces Lincoln to go ahead and, okay, this is going to work. We're going to make the United States colored troops. I'll fast forward the story. So he's been a carriage driver, then he's a soldier. He becomes a state legislator for South Carolina. He forms Aiken County. Why this man of action would suddenly be worrying about county boundary lines, I can tell you, because if you're going to create a sanctuary city and carve it out of some of the most unreconstructed country in America, Edgefield, what you're going to need to do is control the big four: the sheriff, the coroner, the trial justice, and the general of the militia. Rivers is practically all four of those. And for 10 years, a majority Black, but there's a minority of whites in Hamburg, South Carolina, which is the seat of Aiken then. That minority of whites is just fine. Reconstruction is absolutely working under the Black Prince, as he was known. Of course, Hamburg falls in 1876 in the Hamburg massacre as the red shirts run over over the town. And so this guy who had been a carriage driver and then a soldier and then a legislator and then a mayor becomes a carriage driver again.
So two quick questions here. I know we have a little bit of time still. So how do you, which is obviously a gripping story, well, a lot of drama, a lot of action. How do you, unless you've got some artistic talent, and maybe you did, Steve, I'm not sure. How do you translate that narrative, and particularly your research? And as I said to you before, this is one of my misgivings for Steve, for you to do graphic nonfiction, is you write beautiful prose, man. That's gone with this. How do you translate the narrative, and particularly how do you translate it to visual culture?
Okay, so a couple of things about that. Writing is about beats, right? And so even as I've just given you this life in 5 chapters, a window of opportunity that opens and closes for an entire generation of Americans. If you can imagine Rivers returning to the carriage, returning to harness, returning to not being able to go wherever he wants to go, being practically enslaved again. That is writing.
That's right.
Writing is in the structure. We don't, way leads to way writing is the weakest writing in the world. You write at the level of structure. And so this is written, it is conceived. And the other part of this is it needed to be a graphic history, partly because I just think he's a superhero, partly because he doesn't have enough material left over. He didn't have that attic and that steamer trunk. And so his life is very episodic. It would make for a sad biography, or it might. But with this, when he flashes like lightning across the landscape, you bottle that lightning and you display it. And so it's a format. And besides, all of his superiors called him a panther. He is the original Black Panther, and he carved Wakanda out of South Carolina, a sanctuary city for his people. So he deserves to be the original Black Panther. Mm-hmm. He is the Black Prince. So it goes to those choices, which I think actually are writerly choices at the end of the day, Pete, where a writerly choice now has to be format too.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think. Go ahead.
I just you just described, what they call the gutter, right, between these different frames, and it's between that gutter that you can sustain a degree of narrative tension, which of course keeps the reader's attention and keeps the hold and keeps the story moving forward. So as you speak about the form in this instance, not only again I think makes for what will be gripping reading, but the form also plays to what is the sources that you're dealing with in this instance. There's some limitation to this source in terms of there's not great richness to them, but the illustrations can compensate for where the traditional archive is deficient, right?
Right, because what would you otherwise say, that he doesn't deserve a book? This guy,
right?
Absolutely. What about who's going to do the illustrations, man? Are you going to do them?
No, I'm definitely not going to do them. But to your point about beats, right? So there's a beat at the end of every page. In a format like this, you have to decide what its comparative advantages are. Well, you turn pages faster. Every time you turn a page, you're resetting, you're recalibrating. It's a chance for every page is a chance for a cliffhanger. Those are enormous writerly opportunities if you seize them and think of them that way. The last thing I'm going to say is that this is digital scholarship too. We have redesigned or reconceived footnotes themselves for a graphic environment. So this still has all the citations that you want. It lists all of our sources. It betrays none of our academic values. It definitely makes an argument. It just buries that argument in a format that you might not be used to. And it's a proof of concept for the fact that you can always do that. You can always live your academic values. You don't need to check them at the door. Finally, to answer your question, no, it definitely needs to be a collaboration, because you need somebody who can. I cannot finger paint. I mean, when I was a kid, when I would try, I would just always end up crying. I mean, it's just so no. I found an artist from Atlanta who he's absolutely fantastic. And as I say, I wish I had been able to show some of the artwork, but
I'd be challenged with that as well. My work resembles more Jackson Pollock. There's no narrative that translates well to Jackson Pollock. So
No.
I wouldn't be able to do my own artwork, I don't think. So.
Stephen, first, I want to say, as a former drummer, I like the idea of it being a rhythm to writing. That's a nice way to put it with the prose and stuff. I appreciate that. Second, I'm really looking forward to this book because my partner and I, she's into graphic novels and comics and stuff like that, and got me back into it. And so, as a historian looking at history-based graphic history, if you will, it's been really interesting to watch. And I'm actually getting ready to do a book review on video on my forum here about a book that came out a few years ago. It's one on Andre the Giant, actually. So it's like it introduces people to Andre the Giant who maybe have never heard of him. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I think also that it's going to hit a new demographic, right? It's going to hit a different demographic than the traditional quote unquote model may hit with this story. It's because when I'm walking into comic stores, it's kids to 50-year-olds, hanging out in there, and 50s maybe pushing it. But yeah, I think it's going to be awesome in that way that you're going to be hitting a new demographic with this, and people who are genuinely desirous of having that moment of, wow, history can teach me this. I never knew that.
Right.
And getting away from that dry teacher mentality of, we went to them if we wanted to have facts and figures.
Well, the thing is, like, it is about practicing our values, but we should be practicing all of them if they're values all of the time. You can't suspend some of your values some of the time. That just doesn't work. So one of our values in every classroom is to meet them where they are, right? So some students have some learning challenges, or maybe they have a different learning mode, and we're supposed to be attentive to that. And we're supposed to meet that, our first public, wherever they are. But when it comes to the actual public, we're not supposed to do that somehow? No, those are our values. We meet the public where they are. So back to form, function, audience, it's like, okay, well, who am I trying to meet with what message, with what sense of the historical context? Is it online in social media? Is it my classroom? Is it the larger classroom of the American people? Whatever it might be, those are in our values. Our values are not the ivory tower. That's just not true. Or it shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't. Yeah.
Because, Steve, we have to be honest. There aren't going to be many people who will be able to get tenure if they do graphic nonfiction. We're not there yet. And I think that I'll just say it. You're at a place in your career, I'm at a place in my career where we can afford to do this. And we don't have to worry about the colleague down the hall who thinks that what we do is not sufficiently scholarly. But for those up and coming historians who want to go the academic route, that's a pretty treacherous road for them. But the point is that if they can maybe get past that first book, because I don't think we're past the traditional monograph anytime soon, but they get past that, then we have more opportunities, as you said so nicely, to live up to all of our values and to think about all of our audiences, because it's really so exciting. And I have to give a shout out to Civil War Talk Radio, Jerry Prokopovich, and I was listening to it on one of my walks and heard Steve's interview with him, and he talked about many of these issues. Steve and I are fairly close, but of course the pandemic has kept all of us sort of at a distance, and I wasn't aware of all these other things that Steve is involved in, and I'm not at all surprised. And I was like, man, I'm serious. I want to do graphic nonfiction. I want one of my next books, right? The point is we want to get out there and reach as many people as we possibly can. And, I've got all these books behind me. I feel like I should take them all off the shelves. Like, oh my God. But that's not the case. As Steve, as you pointed out, we can operate on all these fronts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and back to training, right? There are still academic values, right? Making an evidence-based argument that connects both to an ongoing argument in our discipline and has some present value. So presentism is an historical sin, that is turning the dead into political sock puppets. Present value, our work has to have that, should definitely have that. So you need to be trained in that, and there's no better discipline or no better way or vehicle for training in academic values than writing your first monograph. Everybody should do that. I believe it is an exercise that is key to everything else that you might do. So Pablo Picasso goes on to paint whatever he paints, but that guy is a master at if he wants to be.
Yeah. And how you're right, how Picasso started, he went through the routine that all great artists had to do before he then ventured off and did something experimental. But
that's why we call it a discipline.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely
right.
Steve, it's been such a pleasure to have you on this show, and you've given us so much to think about. I think so much to be excited about in terms of the future and what's out there for us to read and to listen to. And above all else, man, we're all, again, public historians. Ed Ayers said a very long time ago, this is 15, 20 years. He said, I don't understand this divide. People say that there's academic historians and public historians. If you stand in a classroom before students, you're a public historian. And so, like you said, man, those values we bring to the classroom, we bring to our research, we bring to our public history projects. I use that word. And it's good to see all of them coming together, and that those barriers and divides are coming down. John, it's great seeing you, man, as well. Did you have any final comments here before we say goodbye to Mr. Berry and our audience?
Oh, I just everyone in the audience is very much appreciating what we spoke about tonight. But Stephen, thank you for highlighting the different ways we can do history. Because far too often we think it's a one-sided thing, and it's nice to hear that others are embracing the media landscape. And obviously you've been doing that a while, and others are jumping on, especially due to the pandemic. Making that history accessible has taken on new meaning now. I mean, I got Pete on live streams, which is great, which has been fun in itself. But thank you for highlighting all this. And I've for everyone in the comments, I have placed links to multiple sites for you to check out some of Stephen's work and some of the work of the students. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's in the future.
All right. All right, y'all. Hey, thank you all. Steve, again, thank you so much, John. It's wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please take care of yourselves.